What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice. As today we're talking Season 5, Episode 2 of Dark Side of the Ring, Buff and the Bagwells. Now, this was a nice return to form for the show. I did enjoy last week's episode on Earthquake, John Tenta. Thought it was really well done, really well done, emotional, heartfelt. He was a genuinely good guy. Not to say that Marcus Buff Bagwell's a bad guy, but this was definitely the sort of stuff you would expect to see from the show, like early on in the show's existence. And I've enjoyed a lot of the last couple of seasons, but it kind of feels like they moved away from drastically wild stories. I mean, I guess we kind of got that in the Season 4 finale on Marty Jannetty last year, which was definitely crazy. But we really haven't seen a lot of that since then, as far as like beyond the Marty Jannetty stuff and some other episodes along the way. This was definitely a crazy episode. Now, I know Marcus Buff Bagwell, not personally, but like I know of him. Didn't follow his career because that was well before my time, before I started watching. But I honestly knew nothing of the wild shit that he was responsible for prior to, just recently. And I've heard some stories along the way and the WCW stuff, the match with Booker T on Raw, that sort of stuff. But not really the crazy shit he was involved in prior to that point, after that point. So I thought this episode did a very effective job, to say the least, of shining some light on that sort of stuff. So we'll get right into it here. They open up the episode with Buff/Marcus, and I'll probably just call him Buff because that's what I have down here in my notes, showing off his office. He talks about having two brothers, and all of them were special, and having a really gifted, organically gifted family as far as what they were capable of and being great athletes, stuff like that. The dad, I guess, was a famous drag racer millionaire who made himself a millionaire by doing drag racing, I guess, and got really good at it. They also owned Southeast Lumber, and they were really well off as kids, got everything they ever asked for, but they were pretty spoiled, they admit, but they never really were able to get away with anything. Now, they talk about, like, doing drugs and cocaine and shit like that, but, like, the dad was trying to be a good parent in the sense that he let them do it within the confines of, like, their own house. Like, he would have to know about it, but he wouldn't let them do it outside of the house or something along those lines. It was pretty fucking crazy and obviously very stupid. But the whole point was that they pretty much got everything they ever wanted because they were so well off as kids. It got to a point where the mom took out too many loans for the business. They ended up losing it all. The business had to close. They had no money. They were struggling. And at that point, Buff was the only one in the house. The two brothers had already moved out by that point. So he kind of saw everything firsthand as far as the arguing between the mom and the dad and stuff like that. So the mom just tried to leave one day. The mom, obviously Judy Bagwell, as we know from the whole fucking WCW shit. The mom tried to leave one day, and the dad told her, listen, you're not leaving in one of my cars. And they got into a fight. Now, what the dad did not say, because the dad was interviewed for the episode. I don't know if the brothers were, I forget. I think they were. Marcus's Buff's friend Slick was. I think he was involved in the business, but he was a pretty good friend of Buff. So if you hear me say the name Slick, I'm not referring to the wrestling manager Slick. That's a totally different Slick. This was one of his close friends. And I don't, again, like I said, remember if the brothers were interviewed, but the dad definitely was. The dad's still alive. The mom is no longer here. I'll talk about that later. But the dad left out the part where he beat the mom. Now, to what extent, I don't know. But any physical abuse, any sort of domestic abuse is obviously not good. So Marcus includes that in his side of the story, and that's why he was defending his mom. So he pulled out a gun. I guess they kept guns in the house, or at least one, and Buff pulled it out on his dad. And the dad was kind of like threatening him, probably thought it'd be a bluff. He did end up shooting the dad, and the dad's obviously interviewed for the episode, so he's not dead. He probably would have killed him if his hand wasn't over his heart, though. He specifically said that he put his hand over a certain part of his body that ended up catching the bullet. The bullet, like, grazed part of his bone in his wrist that he had to get removed because it, like, hit that bone in his wrist or whatever. But he probably would have died if his hand wasn't there. So that was fucking crazy. And even crazier than that was the fact that they eventually made up. They went a couple months without talking. You would think it'd be like a few years. But I guess it was only a few months, and they eventually made up. And now they're best friends, according to Buff. They've been best friends ever since, which is just crazy. That's really just kind of a small taste of what the episode has to offer, I guess. From that point forward, I'm like, man, this family is just wild. But anyway, so he ends up moving out, marrying a woman named Tanya. He becomes a male stripper and does that for work. It was around that time that he met Missy Hyatt, who was already in the business as a wrestling manager. She convinced him to join wrestling. I guess Buff had asked her, like, oh, my brother wants to get into wrestling. How does he do it? she told, not the brother, but Buff, like, hey, I think you would be good for wrestling. You should probably try it out. And he didn't think that he would make any money from it. He's thinking, oh, those guys don't make any money. Why would I give that a shot? And she told him, listen, the lowest paid wrestler in WCW makes $100,000. And he was like, holy shit. Like, I'm going to give this a shot. So he left to train, and the trade-off with his wife, Tanya, at the time was, listen, if you leave me to train, I'm going to go off and train, and, she's going to have to take care of the house and really struggle, and she's going to have to support him in his financial ventures and doing wrestling and that sort of shit. If she does that, then he will later, when he makes it in wrestling, and theoretically, which there was no guarantee that he would take care of her. That was the trade-off. So he worked the indies, and within a matter of months, he ended up getting signed by WCW, with Hyatt seeing the progress that he was making, was like, damn, this guy's good. Let me put in a good word for him at WCW. They end up hiring him. Shortly after debuting, he teamed with Too Cold Scorpio, They were a great team. Two newbies in WCW at that point. Scorpio at that point, I think, had already done ECW, obviously. That was where I think his claim to fame was, and probably WWE at that point as well. I forgot at what point in the timeline his WCW run had come. He was actually interviewed for the episode as well, which was cool. I think he's been involved in other Dark Side of the Ring episodes and doing interviews and stuff like that. But anyway, so shortly thereafter, they end up winning the WCW World Tag Team titles. They were like the Tag Team of the Year. They were Rookies of the Year, blah, blah, blah. And even Too Cold Scorpio was really impressed with this kid's progress, thinking, man, this guy's good already very early on in his career. So they got so over as a tag team, women were like throwing themselves at Marcus, at Buff. And he wasn't really used to that. He wasn't ready for it at that point in his career. So he ended up cheating on Tanya. And she couldn't forgive him, so they broke up. She left him, blah, blah, blah. He tells this weird-ass story about getting calf implants, and how, for what reason, I don't know, maybe he mentioned it and I missed it, but I think he probably felt insecure about his calves or whatever. That's the first I've honestly ever heard of that sort of thing. I did not know that you could get calf implants. I've heard of a lot of different implant surgeries, butt implants, stuff like that, never calf implants until I heard him talk about it here. That was crazy. But his body rejected it, and it got to a point where he almost had to cut his legs off. And he actually, debated, should I get my legs cut off or whatever? And he was like, no, just remove the implants. So he still has them in a box at his house, which is just so fucking stupid and batshit crazy and whatever. So we talked about that, which was just a random side story. But again, it gives you a nice kind of entryway into how crazy this guy is/was at that point. So he ended up teaming with Scotty Riggs. They became the American Males. And again, a team I'm not overly familiar with, but I know the name. I've heard the theme song. Eric Bischoff is also interviewed for this episode, and he tells his side of the story and his familiarity with Buff Bagwell and the theme song. And he's like, I hate you guys for bringing this up because now it's going to be stuck in my head for the next week, whatever. So he ended up getting married another time, did Buff. The second wife did not last long. Got married for a third time, weirdly enough, to a woman named Judy, the same name of his mother. That is fucking weird. So during this point in his career, he ended up turning on Riggs, joined the NWO. That was an offer from, I think, either Bischoff or Scott Hall or someone in the NWO was asking him, and like, hey, would you want to join? Like, from a real-life standpoint, he was like, yeah, that'd be a great launching point for my career, blah, blah, blah. It was around this time he was making a lot of money. He hired his family to do stuff for him. Again, kind of weird, including his mom. He hired his mom as a personal assistant / secretary. Just fucking weird. That was like her job title for him. And Slick tells this story of one day walking in on them and on a bathroom, doing some weird shit, but nothing like sexual. Thankfully, that's not where this went. Still just as, maybe not about as weird, but still pretty fucked up. He walked in on them, on her specifically, shaving the testicles of Buff Bagwell from behind. Fucking, again, not a visual I needed to see, nothing that they needed to reenact, but they did anyway. Obviously not the specifics or anything, nudity, nothing like that on this show. But still, it was pretty fucking crazy. I'm like, man, these people are fucking weird. This family is very weird. So he ended up also doing action movies around this point, like straight to DVD / video action movies that were just terrible. And they showed some clips of them here. They were awful. Slick talked about it. I don't know if Buff talked about it, but Eric Bischoff then is like, oh, I don't know how I missed those, and obviously didn't really launch his career, but he probably made a pretty penny from doing those movies, I would think, otherwise why do them? So he ended up injuring his spinal cord in a match with Rick Steiner. He was doing a move off the top rope, in his head, like they show the footage and it's just gross to watch. Even talking about it gives me like, ugh, like just, it's just gross to talk about. But his head bent backwards and he damaged the spinal cord that way. And he got paralyzed, or at least he thought he was paralyzed. So he ended up going to the hospital. The swelling, he said, kind of tricks the body into making it think the body's paralyzed when it's not. So when the swelling went down, he wasn't paralyzed, thank God, so he was fine. Ended up getting 2 plates and 8 screws in his neck anyway. Again, he had some pretty extensive surgery. Was still back on TV within 3 fucking months. That's crazy. Not in the ring, but he was on TV as a character within 3 months. Ended up managing Scott Steiner from that point forward for about 8 to 10 months during his time off. Got back in the ring soon after that. Just crazy. Like, we haven't seen Big E back in the ring in 2 years, but this guy was back in the ring within less than a year. And that's the weird thing about neck injuries. You just never know. Sometimes your career could be over. Sometimes it could be back fairly quickly. Sometimes it could be back almost never or within years. You just never know. So, but during this point, though, when his neck was killing him and he needed painkillers and stuff, he turned to drugs. It was also around this point they brought in Judy Bagwell, his mom, to TV to become a TV star. And I don't know why they thought it was a good idea. This was in WCW, was going down the tubes. They brought him in anyway. They brought her in anyway. And he enjoyed working with her, but it's also still difficult working with family in an environment like that, and just work or on TV, whatever it might be, specifically in wrestling. So it was tough, but, again, he enjoyed that time with his mom on TV. And they make a subtle reference to the Judy Bagwell on a pole match. Just, again, I wasn't even watching wrestling back then, and I can tell you that sounds fucking terrible. And I already knew about that match. It's pretty infamous in the lore of WCW in its final years, but still, that's pretty bad. So WWE ended up buying WCW, and I guess there was a segment where Vince was in the ring talking about the WCW stars, who do we bring in, who do we not, blah, 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 and he mentioned Buff Bagwell's name, and he got a pretty good reaction. So I don't know if it was based off of that entirely, but they ended up bringing him in. He made the cut for the roster to be brought into WWE, and he had a heated confrontation with Shane Helms, aka the Hurricane, while training or whatever, and they kind of went back and forth, and his side of the story is, and Shane Helms later refuted it in a couple days, within like a day or two on Twitter, was like, that never happened. You can ask anyone that was there, anyone credible, they'll tell you the real side of the story, and they never asked me for my side of the story, so again, take this with a grain of salt. But Marcus Buff said that, he got in a heated confrontation with Shane. They were like doing training or whatever, and Shane also came from WCW. He wasn't like a WWE guy at that point, a lot like Buff was, or he was in the same spot as Buff. So it's not like, again, he was a WWE guy trying to test Buff or whatever. He came in around the same time that he did. So I guess he ended up slapping him because he thought that Shane was shooting on him or just being rough with him or whatever. Gave him the Bagwell slap, is what he calls it, his finisher, whatever. And then Shane, after Buff walked away, he hit him over the head with a frozen water bottle. I don't know if he concussed him, but Buff said he ended up bleeding from the back of the head. He needed stitches, put black Sharpie over his head to kind of hide the fact he had stitches and staples in his head from earlier in the day because he had a match that night with Booker T, and that was the infamous match that got WCW killed in WWE. I mean, they still ended up doing the invasion, but as far as they did the whole, having the match on TV for the WCW Championship was kind of a litmus test for whether WWE fans would accept that as a separate form of television on Raw or on SmackDown, bringing back Nitro and continuing on the legacy of WCW in that form. According to Buff, he thought the match was good. He thought it was a well-wrestled match, not a barn burner, but a good match. They did their jobs. The crowd did not see it that way. The crowd shit on it. Vince didn't like it, and he's obviously very hot and cold. He can be super high on an idea one day. The next day he wakes up and he's not. And this was kind of the game changer for Vince that kind of convinced him, hey, this thing will not work. We're dumping the WCW thing, and not only that, we're getting rid of Buff Bagwell. So they ended up firing him from going from a main event on TV. Within a week, he was gone. He was fired from WWE. So that happened. And that from that point forward, he kind of went into a downward spiral. He was working indies and stuff like that, but it really wasn't working out for him. So he did drugs, he drank, became an alcoholic, wrecked his Jeep, got into a really bad accident because he got sober around that point, he said, but he had what he called a withdrawal seizure because his body was so used to all the drugs and shit and probably the alcohol and whatever. So his body, while he was driving, went into a seizure, wrecked his car, flipped over a couple times, didn't die, almost did. They show the pictures of his face from after the accident. It was pretty fucking brutal. It was pretty bad. And they said that the screws in his neck or whatever, the plate in his neck, actually saved his life. Because if that plate wasn't there, the force from hitting the steering wheel or whatever happened probably would have killed him. So from that point, he needed money. So he did a show called Gigolos, and he didn't really think it'd be that big of a deal. He thought it would just be a typical reality show. Gets to the show, ends up finding out that it's like something of like a softcore porno show because he had to have sex, or so he thought. They showed him, like, again, they blur out the woman's face, and it's just super fucking weird. He had to have sex with a woman with his clothes on, but he found out later on from the producers, like, oh, sorry, I couldn't do it because he couldn't go through with it. And they throw in a lot of, like, penis words and stuff like that. A lot of inappropriate shit that I don't really feel comfortable reviewing here because it's not really pertinent to the episode anyway. But anyway, he was like, I couldn't get hard and all this other sort of shit. And the producer was like, well, you're not supposed to have sex anyway. And he's like, well, no one told me that. So he felt really ashamed, really embarrassed. And he was still married to his third wife, Judy, at this point. It was just, he was like, oh, these are the things that you do for money when you're really, really desperate. And it was really bad. He called it a really bad experience, one of the worst points in his life. So from that point, he ended up doing a website called Cowboy for Angels, where people pay for you to, like, have sex with them or sleep with them, stay a weekend with them, whatever, for like $10,000 a person. So he did that as well. And the first woman that he ended up doing this with, he fell in love with. And he called Judy to tell her, hey, I fell in love with the first woman that I'm doing this website with. I'm leaving you. And he regrets it now. And the woman was like, what is going on? Like, this guy is wild. Like, this guy is crazy. And the woman's not even in his life anymore. He's in a relationship or married to someone now, I guess, at the end of the episode. He's still alive, thankfully, obviously, if he was interviewed for the episode. They show him with a different woman now. He regrets leaving Judy, but he's not with the woman that he fell in love with, so to speak, as part of this Cowboy for Angels thing. He just went to the woman with the money. She had a lot of money, fell in love with her, and that did not last long, because she obviously had a lot of issues of her own as well, and probably in addition to the issues that he was dealing with at that time. So leaves Judy, gets multiple DUIs, gets in another car wreck. Again, shocked he didn't kill himself or get someone else killed, more importantly. It was around this time as well, they find out that Judy Bagwell, the mom, not the third wife, gets dementia. So she passes away, and that was kind of a wake-up call for him because he was really sad about it, because he was close with his mom, and she was a hard worker, and she was a tough woman, ended up passing away from Alzheimer's disease. So that was a wake-up call for him. Ended up getting sober, and he stayed with his niece, and then he said, listen, you can stay with me, but only if you get sober. So he did, and he ended up joining DDP's crib later on, Diamond Dallas Page, and he ended up helping Marcus, or Buff, whatever, like I said, because I've just been calling him Buff this whole time. And it was a nice little story here they shared at the end. As part of the episode, I guess, when he found out they were doing a Dark Side of the Ring on him, he was talking with the producers, and the producers said, oh yeah, we're probably going to reach out to Scotty Riggs to talk to for this episode because you guys were teammates at one point in WCW. And he ended up reconnecting with Scotty after so many years on the phone after he was doing well, Buff that is. And Scotty had said, yeah, I've been living in my car for the past 6 to 8 weeks. My mom got really sick and I had to save her, so I lost my house and I've been living in my car, blah, blah, blah. So he was like, listen. And I guess Scotty had said too that he was not too far away from killing himself around this point because he had everything and then he had nothing due to the situation that he was in, the circumstances surrounding it. And he told the story of, like, listen, Buff said this, and Scotty shared the same story. He was like, I'm going to help you out. You can come stay with me. You should go talk to DDP. Come hang here. Get back on the right track. And he did. And I think to the point where Scotty was actually at Sting's last match at Revolution a couple weeks ago, which was cool. So he looks a lot older. He looks very different. I'm not overly familiar with Scotty Riggs anyway, but, I thought that was a nice story that they shared, and, Riggs got back on the same path as well because of that. So they kind of closed out the episode of the ex-wives and Eric and all these other people, Slick, his friend, all talking about him getting back on the right path and being sober for real this time, staying on the right track, and all this other sort of stuff, and why people still really love him, and why he's likable, and all these other things about how he's fucked up over his life, but he's been responsible for it. Maybe not entirely, according to Shane Helms, who has his own side of the story with the whole confrontation, saying that Buff lied, he's always been a liar, he has no love lost for Buff Bagwell. But beyond that, and I'm sure there's other people who feel the same way, All the people they talked to on the episode, anyway, had a lot of positive things to say about him and are proud of the progress he's made to this point in his life. So I thought it was a really good episode. I really enjoyed it. It was definitely crazy. It was the sort of episode you would think they would save for last. Maybe they wanted the dynamic of the contrast of the first episode of the season being a nice heartfelt episode, and then going back to the crazy shit. You would think they would flip it, going from the crazy shit to the heartfelt stuff in the second episode, but it was the other way around here, which tells me they probably have a lot crazier stuff to come on the season. I guess we'll find out. They're doing an episode, I don't know if it's on the Freebirds, because I know Michael PSA's worked for WWE, so I'm not really sure how much of that. He's not obviously interviewed for the episode. But they did an episode on Terry Gordy of the Freebirds, and he's going to be the subject of next week's episode, which should be interesting. But yeah, I enjoyed this one. It was definitely crazy, and the guy's still alive, which is nice. A lot of the times these people are dead, present day, so it's nice that he's currently alive, is Buff Bagwell, Marcus Bagwell. So good stuff here. I enjoyed it. Check it out right now, Dark Side of the Ring on Vice. Looking forward to next week's episode. That will air this coming Tuesday. My review should be up next Sunday here on the channel. Thank you guys for checking out my review. I appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.